January 3rd, 1961. Emergency responders are dispatched to the SL-1 reactor after heat sensors trigger an alarm at 9:01 p.m. Earlier that day, crews had already responded to 2 false alarms, so they expected this one to be no different. But this time, they were walking straight into the most horrifying nuclear accident in United States history. Following the Christmas holidays, 3 technicians returned to restart the SL-1 nuclear reactor at the National Reactor Testing Station near Idaho Falls. Army specialists Richard Leroy McKinley and John A. Burns, along with Navy construction electrician Richard C. Legg, began bringing the reactor back online after it had been shut down during the holidays. The restart procedure required one crucial step. The central control rod needed to be manually lifted exactly 4 inches to reconnect it with its drive mechanism. Only then could the reactor begin generating power again. Burns reached down and grabbed the 84-pound control rod with his bare hands. Supervisor Legg stood beside him, balanced on top of the 9-foot reactor vessel, while trainee McKinley observed nearby. None of them realized that within seconds, their routine maintenance task would turn into catastrophe. The reactor was designed to produce just 3 megawatts of thermal power. Instead, it would surge to nearly 20 gigawatts in only 4 milliseconds. Such an explosion of power, nearly 7,000 times its design limit, should have been impossible. But SL-1 was no ordinary reactor. It was an experimental military design, built during the Cold War to supply electricity and heat to remote radar stations scattered across North America. These isolated stations formed part of the early warning system against Soviet bomber attacks. Powering those sites was nearly impossible. They were cut off from electrical grids, unreachable by conventional transport, and exposed to brutal winter conditions. Rather than abandon the mission, the US military turned to scientists at Argonne National Laboratory, who developed a small, transportable boiling water reactor capable of running independently for years. The concept was revolutionary, but it came with deadly risks. To allow SL-1 to operate for extended periods without refueling, engineers loaded the reactor with 14 kilograms, about 30 pounds, of highly enriched uranium, containing 93% uranium-235. That enrichment level was even higher than the uranium used in the Hiroshima atomic bomb. This made the reactor core extremely sensitive. Even small movements of the control rods could cause rapid and dangerous power surges. To counter this, engineers installed boron aluminum burnable poison strips inside the core. These strips absorbed excess neutrons, slowing the chain reaction and stabilizing power levels. At least, that was the theory. Over time, intense heat and corrosion caused fragments of the boron strips to break apart and slip into the narrow channels surrounding the fuel plates. These fragments could jam the movement of the control rods, the very system designed to control the reactor. And unfortunately, that is exactly what began happening. Between 1959 and 1960, SL-1 experienced more than 80 control rod jamming incidents. The dangers didn't stop there. Unlike commercial nuclear reactors enclosed within thick reinforced concrete containment buildings, SL-1 operated inside a thin steel structure known as Building ARRA 602. Its outer shell was meant primarily to shield against weather and assist with cooling, not to contain explosions or radiation leaks. Even radiation shielding around the core was minimal. Workers relied on movable lead blocks and often stood just feet away from the reactor itself. Exposure levels near the vessel could exceed a modern nuclear worker's annual radiation safety limit in only minutes. Despite these risks, the Army allowed ordinary enlisted personnel to operate the reactor after completing an intensive 9-month training program. SL-1 relied on only 5 cruciform control rods to regulate power, an unusually small number. For comparison, the reactor at Chernobyl used 211 control rods. Among them, one rod was especially powerful. The central control rod sat directly above the region with the highest neutron activity. If withdrawn too far, it could drive the reactor into a prompt critical state almost instantly. No single rod should ever control a reactor by itself. But in SL-1, everything depended on that one rod. Inside a nuclear reactor, fuel plates containing nuclear material naturally release particles as they decay. When these plates are positioned closely together, those particles trigger a chain reaction called nuclear fission, generating massive amounts of heat. Control rods absorb these particles, allowing operators to regulate the reaction. By raising or lowering the rods, operators could precisely control the reactor's power output. The heat produced would then turn water into steam, and steam into electricity. The technicians at SL-1 understood these principles, but it remains uncertain whether they fully understood just how unstable the central rod truly was. Before the holidays, SL-1 had been shut down by fully inserting its control rods, making the reactor subcritical. However, low-level fission still continued, meaning the reactor remained sensitive to rod movement. On January 3rd, as Burns attempted to restart the reactor, he reached down and began lifting the central control rod. Instead of raising it 4 inches, he pulled it 20 inches. Within 4 milliseconds, the reactor became prompt critical. With nothing restraining the chain reaction, neutron production skyrocketed. Power surged beyond 20,000 megawatts. The sudden energy burst flash-boiled coolant water surrounding the fuel, instantly converting it into superheated radioactive steam. Pressure inside the reactor vessel exploded from 20 atmospheres to over 650 atmospheres. The violent expansion of steam slammed water against the reactor lid with such force that the 26,000-pound vessel launched 9 feet into the air. Burns was thrown violently against a concrete wall. Metal fragments blasted across the room, severely injuring Kinley. But the worst was yet to come. The explosion blasted steel shielding plugs from the reactor top, spraying radioactive water and debris throughout the room. One control rod shot upward like a spear, impaling Supervisor Richard Legg through the groin and out through his shoulder, pinning him to the ceiling. At the same moment, heat sensors triggered emergency alarms 8 miles away at the testing station fire department. Responders assumed it was another false alert. They were terribly wrong. At 9:17 p.m., emergency personnel entered an adjacent building wearing air tanks and masks. As they approached the reactor building, radiation detectors suddenly jumped to 25 Roentgens per hour. Believing their equipment must be malfunctioning, they retreated and retrieved high-range detectors. When they returned, readings maxed out at 500 Roentgens per hour, a level capable of delivering lethal radiation within minutes. They briefly entered the reactor room, spotting debris everywhere, but no sign of the operators. Forced back by radiation, they withdrew again. It took over an hour before rescue teams attempted a full entry. By 10:30 p.m., responders heard faint moaning inside the reactor room. They discovered McKinley barely alive and Burns already dead. McKinley was evacuated and rushed toward the hospital. He died before reaching the highway. The contaminated ambulance carrying his body was abandoned in the desert for hours to prevent spreading radiation. The third operator, Richard Legg, was still missing. When responders re-entered the reactor room, one firefighter scanned the ceiling with a flashlight. What they believed was debris was actually Leg's body, pinned above the reactor by a massive shielding plug. Removing him was incredibly dangerous. If the shielding plug fell back into the reactor core, it could dislodge fuel and trigger another nuclear chain reaction. Radiation levels around his body reached 1,000 roentgens per hour, delivering fatal exposure within minutes. Investigators never determined exactly why the control rod had been lifted so far. The most likely explanation was a mechanical jam that forced operators to pull harder than intended. Rumors later circulated about personal conflicts among the crew, but none were ever proven. All three victims were in their 20s. John Burns was only 22 years old. The SL-1 disaster permanently ended the US Army's portable nuclear reactor program. It also transformed nuclear reactor safety worldwide, introducing stricter training standards, improved containment structures, and the one-rod rule, ensuring no single control rod could ever again control an entire reactor. To this day, SL-1 remains the only fatal nuclear reactor accident in United States history.